Okay, in this presentation, I want to talk about Neo-Realism. And I'm going to talk about Neo-Realism more than realism, the Morgenthau, Thucydides stuff, because really that's what we talk about most. And so I really want to focus students on that more than on the dead guys in wigs and togas. Now, modern neorealism really traces back to Waltz. Sure, we got Morgenthau and his 6 principles, and those are good, but Ken Waltz is more influential on the social science of international relations because he's a social scientist. And what he does, and the thing that makes it kind of a neo thing, is that he brings a positivist approach to it. He's going to try and come up with a theory that will explain the behavior of states in a systematic way. This is something the original guys didn't do. Morgenthau was more interested in providing guidance to policymakers and treated it more of an art than a science. Same with Machiavelli and all. Waltz is going to bring out what, and he's going to call his book A Theory of International Politics in 1979. He's going to lay out an explanation of state behavior, particularly with regard to war, and he's going to focus on the structure of the international system. Therefore, this is frequently called structural realism. And so this is really, when people use the term realism in international relations, they're usually talking about this. You have to be careful, because sometimes people will actually be talking about realism, but there's not a strict use of the neo term, not universally. And in fact, Stephen Krasner, who is a realist, and a rather famous one at Stanford, I sat in on one of his courses, and people asked him about the neo thing. He says, if people have a neo in front of it, they don't know what they're really talking about. So you have to be a little bit careful in IR. Sometimes people are more disciplined with their use of the neo than other people will be. Now, because it's scientific, it tries to explain something. That's the dependent variable. And the dependent variable of neorealism is basically war. That's what they're really interested in. They also explain alliances, which are often an intervening variable, meaning they come between cause and effect. But what they're trying to explain is generally war. Very often this is labeled stability in a system, whether or not there's lots of wars or not. The independent variable, the thing that is the cause to the effect, is the international system, which is described as being the distribution of capabilities, i.e. power, right? But Waltz's, one of his contributions is to tighten up the understanding of the word power and say, well, because power is kind of a vague concept. He says, look, it's about capabilities. You have capabilities to do things. So we can look at nations and see their capabilities. And nations with more capabilities will tend to have more power. And we can look at the international system and see a structure in it in terms of how capabilities are distributed across the nations in that system. So that's the structure or the international system that Waltz is so interested in. And this is what the argument here, the independent variable is the thing that causes the dependent variable. It causes the behavior of states, whether they go to war with one another, and also whether they form an alliance with one state or another. Now, of course, we have all the assumptions about the state, and these are important. They are theoretical assumptions, and all theories make assumptions. Okay, the fact that there are assumptions isn't really striking, especially if you're trying to be scientific and develop a theory. And so the assumptions here are basically the way they're modeling the world. And they're going to say, look, the principal actors in the world are states. So we're going to focus on states. We're going to treat states as if each state is a unitary actor. We know there are moving parts, but by and large, we're going to look at a state and we're going to simplify it by thinking in terms of it as one actor. This is sometimes the billiard ball, called the billiard ball analogy, that realists view states as being externally driven, and they're like a billiard ball. They're solid all the way through. There's nothing in there that makes it move or anything. But the idea here is states are going to can be treated as one solitary actor. And the defense for it is that, even though we know there are politics and there are things going on, most states do try to concentrate their foreign policy in the hands of one person or one group of people, usually a head of state. And so there's a lot of effort on the parts of states to design their government to be a unitary actor. Right? So there you go. The other assumption about states is that they're rational. Now, rational here means goal-seeking, right? They do things to achieve a certain purpose, and that purpose is to maximize their security, right? And so, or in other terms, defend their sovereignty, which is another difference. The old-fashioned realists would talk in terms of seeking power. One thing that Waltz brings to it is the idea of maximizing security. Now, there are other realists who will talk about, assume that states don't just simply maximize security, but they maximize power. But the basic neo-realist assumption is states maximize security. Now we have this world system. The world is a state of anarchy, right? That's a big assumption, that we have no overarching power over the states in the world, so that the world is an anarchy, right? There's organization within the states, but not between them or above them. Therefore, self-help is the rule. A state has to look after its own interests. No one will do it for them. They can't make an agreement with somebody, and then if that other state violates it, they can't go to a court and get redress. So there's a big limitation on what you can do, and you can't make agreements and enforce contracts between states. States are in a self-help. If you make an agreement with somebody and they violate it, you have to try to enforce it. The distribution of power defines the world system, right? And again, Waltz defines that as the distribution of capabilities. And in usage, this gets tangled up a bit, but, if you want to measure, you can't really measure power, but you can measure capabilities, right? So the distribution of capabilities, or you can say the distribution of power, that also works. This is what defines the world system. And to be honest, this was always a problem with me with Waltz. He's like talking about the system. I'm like, what system? What structure? Right? It's anarchic. No, in his view, it might be a thin structure, but it is nevertheless, when we look at the world and we see a distribution of power in the world, we can, see that there's a structure to it. And by the way, very often this gets talked about in terms of poles, right? That large concept, if a nation has a lot of capabilities, it is a pole. And we can look around the world, and if there's a lot of very large nations, we have a multipolar world. If there's just two big ones, we have a bipolar world. And if there's just one 800-pound gorilla that's significantly bigger than everyone else, and militarily speaking, that appears to be the United States at the moment, during the days of the Roman Empire, it was the Roman Empire, that is a unipolar system, and we often call that one state a hegemon. So those are the types of systems in broad brush strokes that we see out there, the different structures. The key thing is the world system drives state behavior. States look at the distribution of capabilities around the world. They're seeking to maximize their security, and they behave accordingly. Okay? But the key thing is, this is a systems level theory. We look for explanations of state behavior in the international system. Right? That's what a systems level theory. We can explain why a state's doing something by looking at international factors. not at looking within that state. That's a different level of analysis entirely, right? So these are the key assumptions about the world system. Now, Waltz, in looking at this, he comes up, well, actually the first guy to come up was John Hertz, but Waltz uses the concept of a security dilemma to say, one of the interesting things that happens, the world is, because of all these assumptions, he says, what we see out there is that states will try to maximize their security. To do this, they will do things to try to increase their capabilities vis-a-vis other states, vis-a-vis the states they're threatened by. And they may add to their military, they may grow, they may seek to gain more territory, or they more often make an alliance with somebody to try and say, hey, you and me together, and that will protect me against that threat, and I'll help protect you against another one. These are the sorts of things that states do to deal with the world, deal with the power distribution in the world. The problem is, anytime a state does that, anytime it does something to make itself more secure, it's essentially making itself more powerful. And this in turn makes other states feel less secure. If I form an alliance with somebody to protect myself, even though I'm only doing this for my own security, well, by forming that alliance, I am now more threatening to the person I'm trying to defend against. And so what are they going to do? They're going to go out and they're going to form an alliance, or they're going to build the stuff. And so that will make me less secure. And so this is the dilemma that states face. They can do things to make themselves more secure, but they will make other people less secure, spurring them on to react. The important thing here is that security in this world is a zero-sum game. If I make myself more secure, I make somebody else less secure. And therefore, cooperation is unlikely. And cooperation in this context means pursuing mutual gains with other people. And all of economics is about cooperation. You make a contract with somebody and you get some mutual benefit. Both of you benefit. It's a two-way street. That's a positive sum game. And that's almost the definition of cooperation. But Waltz's argument here, and the thing that comes out of the security dilemma, is that security is a zero-sum game. Therefore, cooperation is very unlikely in the world. Now, Waltz makes predictions about the probability of war. War is more, and the key thing in the Waltz, and when you use realism, this is very important. What drives state behavior? It's the distribution of capabilities in the world. All right. A lot of times people only focus on the assumptions, and they try to explain everything based on the assumptions. Well, the assumptions of realism are what they assume never changes in the world. Right? They assume those are constants, that there's anarchy, that states are rational, that they're unitary, that they're all that stuff. That's constant. What changes in the world is the distribution of capabilities. Right? And alliance structures especially change. Right? But, slowly over time, nations get more powerful. Sometimes several nations come together and they make a bigger nation, or they develop technologies. There's this constant change, this flux in the material capabilities. And then there's more rapid change when nations form alliances and the like, right? And that's what drives state behavior. That, if you want to, and this is a very important thing, that if you ever want to do a realist explanation, you got to start by looking at the power. And more broadly, for Waltz, you have this idea that, hey, look, the type of world you're in broad brushstrokes, the type of system will have a big impact on state behavior. In a multipolar system, there are a lot of poles of power, and nations are worried about multiple people. And because there are a lot of different combinations that can be formed out there, it's very unstable, right? And so we'll be looking at a world, if it's a multipolar world, France is worried about Germany, and so France makes a deal with Russia because Russia's also worried about Germany, but then the Germans make a deal with the Austrians and they start choosing up sides, but they're always worried, right? The French are always have to be worried that, yeah, we have this agreement with Russia, but, maybe not, maybe they won't honor it. Maybe they'll decide when the day comes that there's no point. They won't even bother. Or maybe they'll make peace with the Germans. And so you're constantly worried about things changing. And so the world is very unstable, and it will tend to be war prone. And in fact, sometimes would-be allies will fight against each other over whether or not they're going to be allying or whether they're living up to the terms of their alliances. And so Walt sees multipolar worlds as being the most unstable and war prone. In contrast to bipolar world, well, there's two big nations. And in a true bipolar world, there's two big nations that are so much bigger than everyone else that any combination of the lesser nations can't beat one of them, right? So in a bipolar world, one of the superpowers, they used to call in the multipolar world, they talked about the great powers. In the bipolar world, they talked about superpowers. And kind of the idea was that the classic example is the Cold War. The United States, everyone in the world could gang up on the United States, but if Russia wasn't if the Soviet Union wasn't part of the deal, same for the Soviet Union. Now, while the states are very concerned about their allies and proxies, by and large, they can stand anything, right? They're not too worried about it. There is in shorter terms, there's a natural balance of power between the two very large nations. This world will be according to Waltz, will be very stable because it has a natural built-in balance of power. And Waltz is a big balance of power guy. He thinks that when two states are equally balanced in their capabilities, there's maximum uncertainty about who would win in a war, and therefore war is less likely. And so this is the idea. And so a bipolar world in Waltz's view is stable, peaceful, good. And Waltz had that was very reassuring during the Cold War, right? That was what Waltz's research said. In a unipolar world, and Waltz originally, because he wasn't confronting one at the time, he spent most of his time contrasting the bipolar world of the Cold War with the multipolar world of the great power era in Europe. The unipolar world, well, it'll probably be pretty stable because there's just one nation, but there are some dissenting opinions on that about power transition and other things. But and there will be a lot of the world will be organized around the way the hegemon wants it. And by the way, with the one power, we call him the hegemon, and the hegemon enjoys hegemony. So there we go, some cool words. But these are the things, and it's important to have this in your head, but it's more important if you ever got to use realism to make sure you're starting at the system. And if you're asked to think about how changes will affect the world, are we moving from a multipolar to a bipolar or bipolar to multipolar? What kind of system are we foreseeing in the future? And you can make predictions of whether things will be more or less dangerous. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. Okay, when applying realism, it is therefore very important to start with the power. And this, perhaps this first line is getting old. It's referring to when Bill Clinton was running for president. They famously posted a sign in their campaign war room that said, "It's the economy, stupid." Right? Because they were just hammering on the economy during the campaign. And for realism, good. It's the power, stupid. If you want to analyze something from a realist point of view, you start with the power. And you say, what is the distribution of capability? Or, in whatever question you're asking, how is power involved? And how are potential changes in power going to affect state behavior, or state security, and we can expect states to react to prevent a diminution, another cool word, a lessening of their security. You always have to keep in mind the system as a distribution of capabilities. Again, it's a systems level theory, and it is therefore states are going to act based on the system. To go back to the billiard ball idea, again, realism is very often talked about in terms of this billiard ball analysis, that we have these billiard balls on the table. They're solid, that's I mentioned the rational actor idea. They're solid, there's nothing in them. The other thing is billiard balls all react to external forces. Something bangs against them and they move until they bounce off of something else. So all of the action on a billiard table is explained based on the outside forces. Now, of course, in the realist view, all billiard balls are the same weight. That doesn't hold. You got to imagine a table with, we got some billiard balls. We also have a bowling ball or two on the table, and then a bunch of marbles rolling around, right? And how these things bounce off of each other. That's getting closer to what the realists are thinking. But always keep in mind, it's the system when we're talking about, and notice I'm saying realism, I mean neo-realism, or more specifically structural realism. One thing about realism, it has an objective national interest, right? It explains the world in terms of, these material things. And nations, they have a security, and therefore they have an objective national interest. We don't have to ask what's in their interest. We can look at them and say, where's the security involved? What are their resources? What are their capabilities? What are the capabilities of the people around them that they might have a security problem with? And remember, you have a security problem with someone because that someone can be a problem for your security. We don't have friends. Ideology is not part of this. Democracies don't like each other better than they like dictatorships. There's no culture, there's no history, there's power, right? And so you have a problem with someone who can threaten you. And so we can look, and one of the things about this is you can sit back, and if you look at the information, you can say, all right, this is in their self-interest and this isn't. Which lends, this is part of what makes realism attractive, is you can come up with an answer. And you can, by looking at power, you can fairly easily come up with, okay, this is what this state should do. And they're not doing it, so they're making a mistake. Because they're not pursuing their objective national interest. In other theories, we'll let states pursue goals, and there'll be more flexibility about what goals they're producing, right? That's not realism, right? Realism has this objective national interest, and anytime you have someone talking in terms of that, they're kind of edging over to kind of a realist point of view. And another thing, it's not on the slide here, but I do have to point out that realism also asks you to be objective about other people. And realists are not nationalists necessarily, shouldn't be. Nor are they hawks necessarily. They're people that'll look at the world, they'll look at what Kim Jong-un is doing in Korea, and they won't freak out over it. They'll look at it and say, all right, well, what are his security concerns? Right? He's surrounded by nations more powerful than him. He's got South Korea on his border. It's got a nuclear ally in the United States. It's got Russia and China on its other borders, and China is no longer as anti-U.S. They seem to be getting more chummy with the U.S. And in this environment, the idea that this guy might be pursuing a nuclear program is not in any way shocking. In fact, he ought to be doing it because he's got a really crappy security position. And do you see how, this is, the realists will look at these things and will think of it in terms of that way. And you have to be careful. There's some people like Charles Krauthammer who is a columnist. He's very political. He's very U.S.-centric, very critical of U.S. presidents, but in many ways very hawkish. He talks a realism game, but he doesn't necessarily fill that because he's kind of got more of an activist or rhetorical axe to grind. And so, when you see people vilifying, Iran's terrible, Kim Jong-un, and the U.S. has got to defend itself from these terrible enemies, anytime anyone talks in terms of vilifying anyone, they've almost taken themselves out of the realist camp. And one of the great things about realism is because it gives you a way of, albeit very simplistic, but it gives you a way of analyzing a state's behavior. It asks you to be objective. It demands that you be objective, that you look at it from that state's point of view. What's its security position? What are the distribution of capabilities of the people it's around and can invade it? What's its position in the world? It makes you look at it from that point of view. And that, if realism does nothing else, that's, I think, very useful. So that comes under the heading of objectivity. Ken Waltz likes to say this about realism, this final point. Realism doesn't explain everything, but what it explains is important. And this is Ken Waltz's idea. He says, look, we've made some simplifying assumptions. And, we put a lot of emphasis on security and predicting war behavior, whether states are going to go to war with one another, and also what alliances they'll form. And no, there's a lot of human activity out there in the world that doesn't, fall under this. So he admits it doesn't explain everything, but he says, but what it explains, whether states are going to go to war, their security policy, this is important. And so he recognizes that limitation. And I think, we might also want to keep that in mind, that the theory is not being presented as realists often say it is the most important, and the only time that economic stuff is important is when security isn't at stake. So sometimes they do tend to go that way of saying, oh, it's the only thing. But there is an awareness that, well, maybe there's some room in there for other things. And so that's a take on it. I have noticed, again, I'll go back to Krasner, Stephen Krasner at Stanford, talking about realism. He had another point of view, and this isn't published. He said this in a seminar I was in. He said, the thing about realism is it's very straightforward to use. In any situation, you look at the power and you can make a prediction, and therefore you can write papers. And he said it'll always be around because it's simple. In looking at IR since then, right, those are my graduate student days, very often I think that the reason realism is useful is that people can say, all right, this is what the realists would say in this situation. And very often people do that to try and explain why their theory is better. And you will read many things that say realism is the dominant theory in IR. But my experience is I don't find that many realists. In fact, to find someone who actually describes himself as a realist seems to be very uncommon. And that it seems to me far more common to find people writing papers saying how they're so much better than the realist point of view. To my mind, realism becomes the benchmark because it's easy. You can always say what the realist would say. In contrast, constructivists are at the other end of the spectrum, where I can tell you a constructivist how they'll approach a problem, but they actually resist the idea that they can make ahistoric predictions, right? That they have an ahistoric theory, meaning they have to see what's going on. And so there's a lot of research that has to go on into ideas in order to come up with a prediction. And so it's very difficult in most cases to say what a constructivist would say without doing all the extensive research the constructivists would do. So in many ways, realism is very functional in IR. I'm going to stop short of saying the straw man, but as a very functional baseline to gauge a different theoretical point of view against.